We are the European Union, and this is climate change. To begin with, we're going to give you a brief overview of what climate change is.
Climate change is the increase in the world's global temperature caused by the build-up of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, creating a greenhouse effect to life on Earth. Climate change has a number of effects on the continent of Europe in particular, and these include more extreme weather patterns, which is caused by the heat increase, which causes drought, but also more intense rainfall due to the more moisture in the atmosphere. This therefore has an effect on the likes of creatures and plants that live on Earth and will become extinct due to the changes in the climate because they cannot adapt to the changes that they are surrounded by. The more intense rainfall will also cause more development with floods. The increase in temperature means that more moisture in the atmosphere will create more intense rainfall, and therefore floods in rivers and lakes will become increasingly likely, causing widespread flooding and damage to human life. Floods will also be affected by the melting of the polar ice caps. Due to the increase in temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, the polar ice caps will experience widespread melts and sea levels will rise, and this will particularly affect countries like Cyprus and Malta, who are part of the European Union, to become exposed to the likes of flooding. In fact, scientists believe that by the year 2100, sea levels will rise 1 to 4 feet, causing widespread rises in the sea levels and causing billions of dollars in damage.
GHG emissions have impacted the major EU states. The states you see in the graph have contributed with the highest level of statistics that contribute the rise of 4 dangerous greenhouse gases polluting the EU states' atmosphere. The 4 emissions defined have contributed the EU states negatively in the early 1990s. Carbon dioxide, the most emitted form of human-caused air pollution emitted by burning of fossil fuels. Sulfur oxides, particularly sulfur dioxide, produced by combustion of coal and petroleum. It is described as a colourless gas. Nitrogen oxide, particularly nitrogen dioxide expelled from high temperature combustion. And methane, categorized as either methane or non-methane. Methane is an extremely efficient greenhouse gas which contributes to enhance global warming. Gases formed from agriculture and fisheries, such as rice fields and Arctic seabeds, growth in population, resulting in high demand in oil, gas and food, construction and development, especially forests for wood pulp and farmland, transport, burning gasoline from transport, factories contributing with burning power plants, population being one of the key factors in contributing to global warming, the demand for oil, gas, coal and other fuels mined or drilled from below the Earth's surface, that when burned, it extracts enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, trapping the heat with its pollution, therefore not allowing the heat to exit the Earth naturally.
So there you have it, a brief overview of what climate change is, and just some of the effects that it's going to have on just some of the countries involved in the European Union. We also listed a number of contributions that the European Union have made to climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions. But who is the European Union? Who are we as a stakeholder? Let's look further into that.
We represent the 28 members of the EU with the head office of division based in Brussels, Belgium. We are not inadvertently portrayed as a single stakeholder. The following points suggest that we are made up of many stakeholder groups within the European Union: the Council of the European Union, Voluntary Partnership Agreement, European Parliament, European Commission and EU delegations. Private sector companies also come into place. Private sector stakeholders in the EU mainly include timber importers and trade. Among and within stakeholder groups, there are multiple of priorities, capacities and viewpoints regarding legality of timber products. A central challenge for BPA process is to bridge differences and foster broad support. The EU has taken the responsibility of the Kyoto Protocol that is contracted by each of the individual European Union member states to step up its efforts in reducing climate change with the support of Executive Wing Stakeholder. The European Commission has announced a climate change program in June 2009. This program is aimed to identify all elements relevant in succeeding and developing the EU climate change strategy. Thus, the EU advocates for broad stakeholder participation to assure EU and partner country stakeholders that a VPA is warranted to stamp out any non-credible export in the EU member countries.
The political structure of the European Union is seen to be governed by a board of directors. This is because the Union consists of 28 countries rather than one, each with its own representatives towards the European Union. The Union has a number of significant sectors that comprise of different areas of focus in modern Europe. These include the European Parliament, which represents the EU citizens and is directly elected by them. Secondly, the European Council, which consists of the heads of states or government of the EU member states. Thirdly, the Council, which represents the governments of the EU member states. Fourth, the European Commission, which represents the interests of the EU as a whole. This is where climate change is actually discussed between the 28 states. A directive is a law that binds the member states, or a group of member states, to achieve a particular objective. Usually directives must be transposed into national law to become effective. Significantly, a directive specifies the result to be achieved. It is up to member states individually to decide how this is done. This can also be referred to climate change, as each member state must abide by a particular objective stated by the EU, but must in its own way contribute to the reduction of climate change. A decision can be addressed to member states, groups of people, or even individuals. It is binding in its entirety. Decisions are used, for example, to rule or proposed mergers between companies. Climate change itself is such an important aspect of the European Union that it too has its own sector, where the European Board and the 28 countries' representatives are required to discuss climate change and the solutions to it.
The European Union can be constrained in their response to climate change in political and geographical terms. The Union is generally perceived in a positive light, however, in recent years it sometimes has a limited role in global climate governance. Over a longer period trajectory, the ability to mold the international process has been limited. Both China and India have conceptualized the European climate leadership in regards to global politics exceedingly different to the European Union, which they did not view the need to follow in the same direction. Outsider perceptions and expectations on the European Union can affect our performance towards our response to climate change. For example, if the other countries generally view the EU as managing solutions individually, they may not feel the need to contribute as much effort. While external perceptions have become somewhat less positive in the wake of the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit of 2009, the field of climate change is one in which internal and external perceptions of the EU correspond. Although overall the Union is still perceived as an environmental actor, particularly in their response to the Kyoto Protocol by countries such as Asia, Europe, North America, and Oceania. And it is expected that we will continue in the leading role of protecting the global environment, especially global warming solutions.
Although climate change is not something that can be stopped, the European Union have engaged in a number of solutions that will aid in slowing down the effects of climate change. These include binding national commitments to reduce emissions, the multinational cap and trade program known as the EU ETS, or European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, renewable energy, and energy-efficient industries. Developed in 2005, The EU ETS is the driving force of the European Union's efforts to reduce the man-made greenhouse gases that are largely responsible for global warming and causing climate change. The way that the EU ETS works is that there is a limit placed on the overall emissions from covered installations which is reduced each year. In that limit, different companies can buy and sell emission allowances as they desire. The cap and trade approach gives those companies the ability they need to cut their emissions in the most cost-effective way. Who is involved in the ETS? Well, there are approximately 11,000 power stations and manufacturing plants from within the EU member states, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. Also included are aviation activities within these countries. Around 45% of the total EU greenhouse gas emissions are regulated by the EU ETS. The first trading period, that was a learning by doing process, began in 2005 and ended in 2007. The EU ETS was successfully established as the world's biggest carbon market. The estimated needs ended up being excessive, and as a result the price of the first period allowances fell to zero in 2007. From 2008 to 2012, the second trading period saw the parties of Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein join the ETS on the 1st of the 1st, 2008. As the EU had learnt from the first period, the number of allowances was reduced by 6.5% for this period. Unfortunately, the economic downturn depressed emission and demand by even more. This led to excess unused allowances and credits that continued to weigh on the price of carbon. We also saw aviation become part of the system in 2012. The third trading period, spanning from 2013 to 2020, brought major reform. The biggest changes that have been the introduction of an EU-wide cap on emissions and a progressive shift towards the auctioning of allowances in place of cost-free allocation. Croatia also joined the ETS on the 1st of the 1st, 2013. The fourth trading period will be from 2021 to 2030. The current goals of the EU ETS is to cut emissions by 20% by 2020 and by at least 40% by 2030 in comparison to 1990 levels.
Although the European Union has multiple solutions towards preventing climate change, the effects of it will still linger. The effects for the European Union are shorter winters, drier and warmer summers, with increase in heat waves, earlier rise of spring linked to flood risks, and a later autumn which will extend across a variety of countries and regions. We believe that it is important to address adaptation methods because they can save lives and support our economic growth. Some examples of adaptation are using scarce water resources more efficiently, adapting building codes to future climate conditions along with extreme weather events, growing drought-tolerant crops, setting aside land corridors to aid species in migration, selecting tree species and forestry that will be less vulnerable to fires or storms, and building flood defense while raising against the levels of walls for protection. In 2013, our Commission adopted a EU adaptation strategy which has been welcomed by our member states. The adaptation focuses on three goals: promoting action by member states and climate-proofing action at the EU level, and better informed decision-making. Promoting action by member states encourages all countries within the Union to contribute to funding and help with economic growth. Climate-proofing is making Europe infrastructures more resilient from natural and man-made disasters. Being better informed about decisions will work to address individuals' understanding of what climate change is and what we are working to accomplish in the future. This strategy supports actions through greater coordination, promoting information sharing between member states and thereby ensuring the Union's adaptation considerations are all addressed to relevant policies.
Right from the beginning, the EU was a driving force in the development of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol. At the Paris Climate Change Conference in 2015, the EU took on the role of both leader and mediator in international climate policy. The EU is trying to get all nation states to limit the increase of global mean temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. A top priority of the EU at the lead up to the Paris Climate Change Conference was the mitigation of GHG or greenhouse gas emissions and ensuring transparency of all participating countries or stakeholders. The EU also demanded a treaty that contained fair, ambitious and quantifiable mitigations by all parties. It wants this treaty to include a review mechanism every 5 years. The EU has also worked hard to build bridges and coalitions with other nation states, especially with vulnerable states. The EU has aimed to be very diplomatic and an active player in negotiations with all the other stakeholders in the lead up to the Paris Climate Change Conference. For example, the EU was actively engaged on a number of forums such as the Major Economy Forum on Energy and Climate and the G20.